Okay, chapter 8, intelligence. We are going to talk about all the different theories of intelligence. There are lots of competing theories, so we're going to talk about what people have thought about and researched over the years. Then we're going to talk about how we go about measuring intelligence and why it even is worth measuring intelligence. We're going to talk about the biological aspects of intelligence very briefly, and then we're going to talk about the exceptionalities. So exceptionalities are either very high intelligence or very low intelligence compared to the average. All right, so there are lots of competing theories here, and one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that intelligence is adaptive. So people with high intelligence tend to be good problem solvers, and they tend to be able to adapt to new situations. And if you think about it historically, that is that's kind of part of the survival instinct, right? That the Darwinian aspect of that is that there are certain people who are more likely to survive because they can adapt to a changing environment. So that's one of the things that we look at. It involves the ability to learn, okay? So I may have mentioned this before, and if I have, I'm going to mention it probably 3 more times at some point. I don't like to call kids smart. I don't like to say you're so smart when we're talking about intelligence. I prefer to say to them that you're a good learner, because what I've learned from making mistakes myself and other people is that oftentimes when you have a gifted kid and you tell them how smart they are, their concrete understanding of the world makes them believe that they know everything. I'm smart, I know stuff, I know all the stuff. But it can make them perfectionistic, and it can lead them to believe that they should know things, which makes it harder for them to learn, because when they make a mistake or confront something that they do not know, they end up feeling terrible about themselves, and they feel bad, and then they defend against it, and then they're like, I already know that. They don't necessarily present well emotionally when it comes to things they don't know. So intelligence is not about the stuff you know, it involves learning ability, okay? And then it involves the stuff you know. It involves a lot of different mental processes, which we're going to go over, and what is considered intelligence is often culturally very specific, okay? So we have a textbook definition here: the ability to apply past knowledge and experiences flexibly and in a culturally appropriate manner to accomplish a challenging new task. See how it involves all of those things in our definition. All right, so let's talk about this. Where did this all come from? So when we were starting to put together a basic, this was over in France, I think it was, a basic educational system, there was a guy named Alfred Binet who was trying to figure out how to categorize kids into different learning environments. And so he was really looking for ways to find out who needed more help or who was doing poorly, and how to predict that based on giving them a test, say at the beginning, right? So he created a test that looked at general knowledge, vocabulary, visual perceptual stuff, their ability to remember new information, and their capacity for abstract thought. And he compared that to his expectations based on theory of what kids should be able to do at different ages. So based on previous research that was done on cognition, think Piaget, right? These 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8, really go together with regard to putting together a framework for us to understand how children grow and learn and become intelligent little human beings as they move through your classrooms. All right, so we're going to talk about models of intelligence because people have debated whether there's one characteristic or a lot of characteristics that could be considered intelligent. We're going to talk about different intelligences, which is the one that I want you to focus on the most. And they've debated whether it's inherited or if it's strictly from being offered opportunities and experience. You know, little foreshadowing, it's both. It's always both. Okay, so in the early 1900s, we really were looking for something called a G, Spearman's G, which is this really general factor, a single number that we could come up with, a capacity, a reasoning ability that correlated into this one thing called Spearman's G, and it rated your overall intelligence. Okay, some research does say that there are common factors that go into this thing we call intelligent, especially highly intelligent. But others say that, I don't say that it doesn't exist. It absolutely does exist because factor analysis exists. But whether or not it's important is what I want you guys to think about for yourselves. Metacognition, right? Chapter 7. I want you to think about for yourselves what works for you and what you think. And I'm going to share with you my scientific opinion and my experiential opinion. And then you guys need to sort of work in your own thoughts around all of this and integrate this into how you are going to approach your classrooms, quite frankly. Okay, so let's talk about these different things. So we have Cattell-Horn-Carroll, as in, by the way, John Carroll. So Cattell talked about these two different kinds of intelligence. One is fluid, which is more adaptive, and crystallized, which is more a fund of knowledge. So crystallized intelligence makes you wise. Fluid intelligence makes you adaptable, okay? So learning new things and processing new things, that kind of stuff. One of the things that's interesting with aging is that as you get older, your fluid intelligence, like your ability to learn new computer skills, et cetera, may slow down, and you may struggle with learning new things. But because you have such a vast crystallized intelligence, you end up with what we call wisdom. So you understand the world better, but it may be a little bit harder to learn new things. So then Horn and Carroll come along and they refine that into a strata system. So stratum 1 is very specific abilities, meaning there are 70 to 100 different specific abilities. And then that gets factored down into 10 broad abilities, and then factored again into this concept of general overall intelligence. And you're going to see in our modern testing where all of this stuff kind of comes to play in terms of how we look at tests and how the tests that kids are going to have on their IEPs that you as the teacher are going to be seeing and reading the reports on, how all of these strata are still very much involved, right? So we have these 3 tests that all measure some different type of spatial ability. And then these 3 spatial ability factors correlate into, something else. And then those 4 factors, spatial reasoning, verbal, conceptual or problem solving, then get factored and averaged together to get an overall IQ score, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is one of my favorite theories, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. This is the one that I want you guys to really consider and think about in your discussion questions this week, because I want you to really understand the strengths that each child brings to a classroom. Somebody might not be good at math, but they may be spatially really, really talented. Or they may have a musical and math ability, but their interpersonal skills are not so fantastic, right? Somebody could be really good at naturalist, which is science, but not a very good athlete, which is body kinesthetic. So we want to really be able to talk about different intelligences and things that raise kids' self-esteem, because they're the things that are strengths for them, okay? And we want to make sure we always have kids, while we're helping them to learn things that are hard for them, that we always give them opportunities to demonstrate the areas where they excel, where their strengths are. And then, so Sternberg's theory of successful intelligence, so he looks at analytic, which is the ability to solve problems, creative intelligence, that's a whole new area. People are studying things like creativity and flow and thinking outside the box. Somebody can be really good at memorizing facts and figures, but may not be able to be really, really creative. And be inventive and use things in a way that you wouldn't have expected to use things before. And then practical, which is more your day-to-day kind of getting through it types of intelligence. 3 factors involved in this. You have the environmental context, meaning what you're exposed to, previous experience, what's happening, prior experience, what's happening before, environmental context, what's happening now, and then your cognitive processes. So that's all of the things that we talked about in the previous chapter. All right. in distributed intelligence, so they're trying to figure out, that intelligence is not just the stuff that you know, right? But your ability to use tools and technology, those are physical mechanisms, and working with others. And so you can have somebody who's really, really intelligent with their knowledge of a something, but if they can't use it adaptively, then it's really hard to function in the world, right? I'm thinking about some folks with autism who have some what we call savant characteristics, right? Special abilities. You tell them your birth date and they can tell you like the day of the week you were born on. That's fascinating, and that's kind of a weird process to have, and you would think, oh my God, they're so smart. But there's nothing adaptive about that, right? They still, that doesn't help them manage their money. It doesn't help them to exist in the world. So how do we classify that with regard to intelligence, right? That's some of those questions that we're trying to answer. If you cannot use it practically in the world, then how do we deem that on the realm of what we call intelligence, right? All right, so culture matters. Some people are more interested in interpersonal stuff than they are logical thought. Some places they want kids to memorize facts and figures and be really good writers, but maybe they don't focus so much on problem solving. That actually happened when I went to Trinidad. A teacher told me that she feels like their kids might be 2 years ahead of the United States kids when it comes to content, but they memorize a lot of stuff and they don't get as much practice in independent thought and problem solving, and that puts them at a slight disadvantage in a global marketplace. And then the context matters. So the context of your job, the context that you're in, may call for more creativity. There's a difference between doing a job and being a leader who helps other people do that exact same job. You have to have management skills, which is a different kind of skill, and it needs a more strategic, abstract thinking person rather than a structured, maybe doing person. Okay. All right, measuring intelligence. We have lots and lots of ways to try and measure intelligence. We have measures of general intelligence, like an overall IQ test, which the kids at school are given. We can have a specific abilities test. We can give somebody a mechanical ability test. Those are kind of fun. They do things that, like, okay, there's 3 gears and they're interlocked, and then one of the gears has an arrow going in one direction, the other gear has an arrow going in a different direction, and then your job is to figure out if this gear moves in that direction, that makes this gear move in that direction, which direction will the third gear move in. Okay, that's mechanical intelligence. They often give that to people who are applying for jobs in manufacturing. And then dynamic assessments or flow assessments, and then developmental assessments are usually surveys that, although Binet is really a developmental assessment too, it just measures sometimes more adaptive skills. So you may interview somebody and say, are they dressing themselves? Do they recognize this object or that object? And you sort of assess them at very young ages because they can't participate necessarily before the age of about 4 or 5 in a more structured test of general intelligence, plus the fact, well, we'll get to that. Let's just get to it. So tests of general intelligence, the WISC and the WACE, which is for adults. The WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, is ages 6 to 16. Then we go into the adult one. So now think back to what I said about all those components of intelligence. You have 15 different subtests that combine together to make 4 composite scores, okay? So out of the 15, these 4 are all related to verbal. These 4 are all related to perceptual, okay? These 4 are all related to processing speed. So those are your composite scores. Then those 4 composite scores are averaged together to create an overall full-scale IQ. So it makes sense, right? The more consistently high you are in the subtest, the more consistent your composite scores are going to be, and the higher your overall IQ is. But if you are good on, say, 40% of the subtests, and you end up with high scores on one composite score and low scores on another composite score, first it's going to drop down your overall average of your general intelligence, but it also may it may be the same number, right? Let's say somebody does average across the board on everything, and then they get average all 4 composite scores. That's going to give them an average IQ. But if you get really high in one area, you're super verbal, but you get really low in perceptual, when you average those composite scores, you're going to get an average IQ, because the high and the low average together and cancel each other out, right? So there are so many different ways to get an average IQ score that I personally prefer to see the composite scores, and I want to see the subtest scores, because that tells me which aspects of verbal are they good at and not good at, or are they good at all of them, or are they bad at all of them? Like, I want to see all of that kind of stuff. So I tend to dig pretty deep into an IQ test. Stanford Binet, that was the original one. That test is really, really laborious. It is long and it is laborious. It is a big, huge box of manipulatives. And you have kids engage in all of these different activities. And it gives an overall IQ, it gives a verbal and a nonverbal, and then it gives some specific ability scores around perceptual stuff and processing. We don't use it hardly at all. It has become a bit of a relic because it just takes hours and hours to administer. Nonverbal intelligence tests. Okay, so that one, Universal Nonverbal Intelligence Test, I actually prefer the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, because it gives you an assessment without the person having to verbally respond to you. They may, you may say, which of these 6 pictures shows happiness? Which of these shows a ball? Which of these? So it can go highly complex or it can go very simplistic. And then cognitive assessment systems are attention, planning, that kind of thing. So it looks at almost contextual stuff, I think, when coming to sort of a general IQ. I don't use those very often either. What is an intelligence score? So the thing to know is that the average IQ is 100, okay? When they say IQ originally was age times 100, like your mental age over chronological age times 100, what we do now is we compare a person's performance with the performance of same-aged people, and that turns into what we call a standard score. The nice thing about a standard score is that the average all the way across every kind of test that uses a standard score is 100, okay? So if you have a 129 IQ, but then you are given an achievement test, which does math, spelling, and reading, those will also be given like a 100 or a 110 or a 115, and you can compare those scores between tests. So that is the bonus of the standard score as we understand it now. Intelligence tests measure intelligence. Sure, we try to correlate it, validity and reliability, you know that from science class, right? The validity of something is, does it test what we say it does? And reliability is, does it measure things consistently over time? IQ tests get more stable after the age of 6. And does it measure intelligence? You know what? It measures something close to intelligence. It doesn't measure creativity, so it doesn't measure a lot of Gardner's types of intelligence, body kinesthetic and things of that nature. It doesn't measure that. So it measures a certain kind, I think, of intelligence, but it does in fact predict academic success. And that is why it is used so much in the school systems. All right, so dynamic assessment is the flow, it's learning potential, it's learning in new situations, so it's kind of specific. I think it's an interesting test. And it will test sometimes what we call testing the limits or response to intervention, okay? So we assess a child's ability to respond. This is also part of getting an IEP, is you have to first assess abilities to benefit. So if we take a kid, let's say we take a kid from the inner city who hasn't had a lot of resources, okay? And they test low. We can't assume that they're not smart, because we have a lack of resources in the past. So we have to evaluate their learning potential by doing a response to intervention assessment. So we try to intervene with tutoring and all kinds of other things to see if under the right circumstances, the learning potential is there and that child can catch up, right? That is so that we don't have a bunch of kids from the inner city being put on IEPs and in special ed because we say they're not intelligent. We have to be super, super careful about that. And then obviously the developmental assessments. APGAR scales, that's done at birth. That looks at reflexes. So we can start testing developmental appropriateness right at birth. Then we have behavioral assessment scales. We have the Bailey scales of infant development, which is a lot of questions and answers about what kids can do, and you observe them and all kinds of other things. The WIPSI is the Wechsler test for preschoolers. And it's really just it's a test that kids take directly. It's from 4 to 6. I don't think those scores are consistent over time, but they can tell you almost things like readiness, right? Kindergarten readiness and stuff like that. What are the critiques of testing kids? Western culture. These tests were designed in Western culture, so they don't always go over well. Sometimes kids from the inner city with less resources test poorly on them because of exposure issues. If we use them out of context, we make sweeping conclusions and generalizations about things. So we have to be very, very, very careful about how we look at IQ tests. So it is not your job to explain the value to parents. I just wouldn't. I mean, that's the job of your school psychologist, quite frankly. That's who's going to be doing those tests. But I do school psychologists are not taught to give kids feedback on their IQ tests. We put them through 3 or 4 hours of testing before their IEP process, and they never get the results. That drives me crazy. I always sit down with kids and explain their test results in a way that they can understand, where I talk about their strengths and then I talk about their struggles. I use the word troubles or struggles. And most kids by 6 years old can resonate with, I'm not good. I don't feel good when I do math. And so their scores are not very surprising. But then I'm able to say to them, but now we know exactly what it is about math that makes it so hard for you. And we can now figure out a way to help you with that. So you always kind of can give a positive spin. Always expect kids, don't ever take these scores and go, oh, well, now my expectations have to drop. Expectations should stay the same. The understanding for the need for a different way of teaching is what comes out of these kinds of tests. All right. So how inheritable is intelligence? It is true that IQ scores become increasingly stable as you get older. They are accurate predictors of future academic achievement. And, we start out, I'm going to summarize these next few slides. We start out with a biological potential, okay? And some people's biological potential in different areas absolutely tend to be biologically driven. And the reason that we know this is because we compare monozygotic identical with dizygotic fraternal twins. Not only do we do that, but we look at twins that are reared together or apart. Now, it's not easy to find twins that have been adopted out separately, but we do look at those. And what we find are that overall, twins are more similar than other siblings. Like twins that are identical are more similar in their intelligence than twins that are fraternal. And that even twins that are reared apart are more similar to each other than they are to their adoptive siblings. Okay, so genetic does play a role. But nature or nurture, meaning the environment that you're in, will determine if you maximize that potential. Right? If you are born and you are not given the right environment to thrive, you're going to minimize your intellectual potential. So environmental factors, a lot of things having to do with poverty, adequate nutrition, that's why we feed kids at school, toxic substances like lead, which can really impact a child's development of language, early intervention, which is why we have Head Start, the home environment, which has to be nurturing and offer opportunities to expand your thinking. Okay, go back to the last chapter. think about what the recommendations were in order to promote all of these different cognitive processes. That's not just done at school, that has to be done at home. And then, of course, the way formal schooling works and what their resources are at the school, or lack thereof in this case. So heredity establishes the range, and then whether you maximize your potential has a lot to do with environmental conditions, all right? Now, some kids who have a strong capacity will enjoy learning so much that even in the worst of circumstances, they will seek out their teacher. They will seek out ways to learn because it feels so good to their self-esteem to do these things that come easy to them. Hope that makes sense. I don't like any of this stuff. I don't want you to pay attention to it. Okay, fine. Based on research, boys are more likely to have intellectual disabilities. That's true just by diagnostics. Excuse me. Girls may be slightly better in verbal tasks. Boys somewhat better in tasks involving visual spatial reasoning. Okay, whatever. Slightly better, somewhat better. We just want to maximize everybody's opportunity to maximize their potential in every way we possibly can. Children from lower income families have somewhat lowered measured intelligence. This is why we have to do that response to intervention thing before we do special ed, because we want to make sure that these poverty issues are not impacting a child's ability to maximize their intellectual potential. Again, this is all the same stuff. Ethnic and racial stuff is related to socioeconomic stuff, and that's related to cultural stuff, which is related to our difficulty in measuring intelligence based on different cultures and on our tendency to look at what resources have been available. All right, so what do we have to do? Support early intervention programs. Downplay potential problems with evaluation. That doesn't mean downplay like say it's not important. It means making sure you're evaluating children and then following through. And then cultivate intellectual abilities in every way we can through every experience. Every moment of a child's life is not something you have to structure with flashcards, but every moment in a child's life is developing their intellectual potential. Everything is a teachable moment. Everything is a teachable moment. The kids who are spending this end of the year studying online are learning different skills than they would have learned if they were learning in a school environment. It is changing their cognitive processes, and we may find that that's not such a bad thing down the line. We're going to have to maximize everything we're doing here because we're all learning new skills and new ways of thinking by doing things completely differently right now. And who knows what kind of students they're going to be next year, but they're going to be different kinds of students next year. And we have to sort of evaluate what the impact of all of that was. It's going to be super interesting come fall. All right, so let's talk briefly. Sorry, let me go back. Stop it, go back. Okay, so let's talk briefly about exceptionalities. We talked about gifted, and we're going to talk about disability. Here's what I want you to understand about gifted kids. Gifted kids typically have an overall IQ of 129 or above, okay? So they have to be pretty strong in all areas. You aren't going to get a gifted and talented kid in your enrichment programs that is high in one and low in the other, because that's going to come out as average and they won't make the cut. So they have to be pretty strong in all areas. They tend to process information quickly, they tend to remember it in long-term memory easy, and they tend to develop precociously with regard to reasoning, metacognition, abstract thinking, and problem solving. So all of these things can make for a very difficult kid in the classroom. They can be perfectionistic, they can assume they know things already, they'll ask you so many challenging questions about why something is true than you might expect from other kids, and it's because their brain tells them they have to. Their cognitive processing is so they need tasks that are different. They need special education because they need something that's a little more challenging content-wise maybe, but not just that, they need more integrated ways of learning it. They need to be able to play with things and take things apart and experience things, and then they need to move on, right? They need to be ready to move on because they move a lot faster, and that's why we want those enrichment activities for them, and then all the stuff on this page. Children with below average general intelligence tend to be a little bit slow in all areas. You aren't going to test at a 70 or below for a developmental disability or an intellectual disability by having a high and a low. You're going to come out average, okay? If you have a high and a low, you're going to be average. So you can have average, average, you can have high, low, average, you can have high, high, gifted, and then pretty much you get like a 70, you're pretty much scoring below average on just about everything on a test. So we tend to focus on practical intelligence, like daily living skills, management of money, good decision making, social awareness, how to conduct yourself, but it usually stays pretty concrete. Morality is pretty concrete, following rules is pretty concrete, and basic skills can stay pretty concrete, okay? And then there's some movement within that you will learn in your class on special education. That's what that class is for. So encourage them to use their strengths because they don't always feel good when they are confronted with things that they can't do as well as everybody else. That can be super frustrating for them. Introduce new material at a slower pace. Stay concrete, very specific language. They need extra help in how to study. They usually need some help and scaffolding with regarding to studying, so their parents have to do a lot more. And then encourage self-determination, meaning, get them excited about learning new things. A lot of times they get into a place where they just want to avoid it. And we lower our expectations. You want to push them because when you meet up with somebody with a developmental delay, you really don't know what their academic ceiling is going to be. And so you just keep pushing them until you find it. All right, here are the take-home messages. Theorists don't always agree on what intelligence is. Our purpose of intelligence tests is to identify individuals that need more or less than what we are giving them in the school system. There is some biological inheritance there, but there's a huge environmental impact on the manifestation of that potential. And gifted and talented students have exceptionalities as well, and they need individual instruction. All right, that is Chapter 8. I will be uploading Chapter 9 very soon.